When historians describe Tennessee in 1845, their attention usually lingers on what rose into view: westward expansion, agricultural prosperity, and the steady growth of the American frontier. Yet the true story, largely absent from newspapers and still hidden in archival margins, unfolded underground. It commenced with a straightforward farming necessity. A group of workers received orders to dig a well on the property of William Shumert, a landowner in White County, Tennessee. The objective was utilitarian: penetrate the soil, reach groundwater, and secure a reliable source for the farm. But the instant workers started excavating the earth, something unforeseen occurred. They pierced through strata that had remained concealed for centuries. At a depth of 50 feet, far exceeding what any well typically required, the team discovered bones that matched no recognized human remains. Their positioning was peculiar. Their depth was remarkable, and the skeletal structure bore no resemblance to anything in documented anatomy. The measurements were impossible, the proportions were disturbing, and the sheer magnitude of what they unearthed would challenge everything the scientific establishment claimed to understand about human history. This never appeared in official statements. It failed to dominate the newspapers for long. Yet in that year's scattered documentation, a specific phrase emerges repeatedly: giant skeleton, unprecedented size, deeper than anticipated. The authorized account would eventually reduce all of this to exaggeration, misidentification of animal bones, or merely frontier folklore. Nothing remarkable, nothing deserving serious attention. But the newspaper reports from that period, the ones published while the discovery was still fresh, reveal something else. They reveal workers positioned beside bones so massive that grown men appeared childlike by comparison. A skeleton reportedly measuring 18 to 20 feet in length, with a skull large enough to fit over a man's head like a helmet. A skeletal structure so heavy that multiple accounts claimed it weighed 1,500 pounds. And the most disturbing detail, this wasn't a solitary discovery. Throughout the 1800s, similar findings emerged across Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and surrounding regions. Giants discovered in burial mounds, giants unearthed during construction projects, giants revealed during agricultural excavation. Different locations, different circumstances, yet the same impossible measurements, the same peculiar depth, the same subsequent silence. When William Shumert's workers advanced past the initial strata of Tennessee soil, the assumptions were straightforward. They anticipated discovering bedrock, possibly some scattered stones, and eventually water. Nothing peculiar, nothing exceptional. But at 50 feet beneath the surface, that premise disintegrated because rather than reaching the water table, the crews unearthed skeletal remains that didn't function the way human anatomy is meant to function. The initial anomaly was proportion. Every bone, femur, radius, skull, ribs, appeared to maintain human structure, yet at a scale that defied medical understanding. The skeleton wasn't merely tall, it was architecturally different, proportioned for a body that would have stood between 18 and 20 feet when living. Measurements that, according to every accepted principle of human biology, cannot exist. Yet the workers weren't examining folklore. They were standing in a 50-foot excavation surrounded by physical evidence. Bones that required multiple men to lift. A skull so enormous that witnesses described placing it over their own heads. Teeth the size of a man's thumb. Ribs thick enough to be mistaken for fence posts. And then arrived the decision that transformed this from a curious discovery into a documented phenomenon. The skeleton was displayed publicly. For a period of weeks, possibly months, the remains were exhibited in a theatre. Citizens paid admission to witness what newspapers were calling the Tennessee Giant. Descriptions appeared in multiple publications. Measurements were recorded. Witnesses provided testimonies. This wasn't a rumour circulating through isolated communities. It was a public spectacle, documented in the press, observed by hundreds, perhaps thousands of individuals. The skeleton existed. The measurements were recorded. The evidence was undeniable. initially, the scientific community attempted to classify the discovery in the most straightforward manner: unusual genetic anomaly, misidentified mastodon remains, exaggerated frontier tale. But as documentation accumulated and additional giant discoveries emerged across the region, the contradictions expanded. Why were these skeletal remains consistently discovered at depths far exceeding typical burial practices? Why did the bone structure maintain human proportions despite impossible dimensions? Why were similar discoveries emerging across multiple states, in locations separated by hundreds of miles, yet sharing identical characteristics? And the matter that disturbed even the most conventional anatomists: why were these remains so structurally complete? Giant skeletons weren't fragments or isolated bones. They were intact skeletal systems positioned as though deliberately interred, discovered in locations that suggested intentional burial rather than random fossilization. Survey documentation from the 1840s demonstrates this unmistakably. Multiple newspaper accounts describing identical findings. Workers positioned beside bones that shouldn't exist according to established science. Measurements that defied biological possibility, yet appeared repeatedly in independent reports. But the most troubling detail was not what surfaced in the newspapers. It was what failed to surface in the archives afterward. The authorized scientific reports composed in the years following the discoveries scarcely reference these findings. Certain illustrations exclude the measurements altogether. Particular accounts are condensed with indefinite terminology like unusually large remains or abnormal skeletal structure, even though the original reports demonstrated they were far more extraordinary than that. The quiet is difficult to overlook, because if these giant remains genuinely belong to recognized human populations, why weren't they preserved in museums? Why weren't the exceptional anatomical characteristics recorded thoroughly in scientific journals? Why were the skeletal remains dispersed, hidden, or simply vanished from public view? Even certain bone measurements presented a concern. Proportions too consistent across multiple discoveries, burial depths too uniform for coincidence, skeletal preservation too complete for random geological processes. Evidence that appeared less like evolutionary anomalies and more like an entirely different human population. A population that, based on the conventional chronology, never existed. When you examine the trajectory of the Tennessee giant following its public display, something becomes impossible to disregard. The skeleton didn't simply return to private ownership. It vanished, not gradually, not through natural deterioration. It disappeared. The public exhibition ceased abruptly. The skeletal remains were removed from display. And within a remarkably brief period, the physical evidence that had drawn crowds and generated newspaper coverage simply ceased to exist in any documented location. The authorized explanation: the skeleton was too fragile for continued display, or it was returned to the Shoemate family, or it deteriorated due to improper preservation. But none of these explanations account for the completeness of the disappearance. Not a single bone preserved in a museum. Not a single fragment retained for scientific study. Not even photographic documentation from the public exhibitions. For a discovery that generated such public interest, that was documented in multiple newspaper accounts, that was observed by hundreds of witnesses, the physical evidence vanished with suspicious thoroughness. And this is where the Tennessee discovery transforms from an isolated curiosity into evidence of something more systematic. Because the 1845 giant wasn't unique. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, giant skeletal discoveries emerged repeatedly across North America. Federal institutions received numerous giant remains. Newspapers documented discoveries in burial mounds throughout the Ohio Valley. Archaeological expeditions unearthed oversized skeletal structures in locations spanning from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Different decades, different locations, yet the same impossible measurements, the same subsequent disappearance. Official correspondence from government repositories acknowledges receiving these remains. Internal documentation references giant skeletal acquisitions. Yet when researchers attempt to locate these specimens in modern collections, they discover nothing. The bones have vanished. The documentation has been minimized. The physical evidence has been systematically removed from public access. The further researchers investigate, the more peculiar the configuration becomes. Giant discoveries weren't random. They emerged from specific contexts. Ancient burial mounds, earthwork constructions, deliberate interments, positioned at extraordinary depths. These weren't accidental fossilizations. They were intentional burials, suggesting a culture that understood ritual, possessed organizational capability, and constructed monuments that still exist across the American landscape. Mounds that mainstream archaeology attributes to Native American cultures, yet which contain skeletal remains that don't match documented tribal populations. The mounds themselves present additional mysteries, constructed with geometric precision, aligned with astronomical phenomena, built on scales suggesting enormous labor investment, and beneath them repeatedly the discovery of remains that challenge accepted human history. Workers from the 1800s described these findings in private correspondence. Skeletons positioned in seated arrangements, burial chambers constructed with stone that required tremendous effort to transport, grave goods suggesting sophisticated cultural practices, and invariably skeletal dimensions that exceeded normal human proportions by factors that make no biological sense. Shortly following these discoveries across multiple states, something peculiar started occurring. Reports were minimized, newspaper coverage decreased, academic institutions ceased acknowledging the findings, deep burial excavations were discouraged, certain archaeological sites were restricted from further investigation. Portions of this were formally designated as respect for Native American burial sites, a reasonable and ethical consideration. But the determinations about which sites to restrict and which findings to suppress generated subdued questions among researchers, because the discoveries that vanished most completely were invariably the ones that contested the authorized chronology the most. The 18-foot skeletons, the elaborate burial constructions, the evidence of populations that preceded recognized Native American cultures. These findings were systematically removed from scientific discourse. Their physical evidence disappeared into institutional storage, their documentation minimized in academic publications, their existence quietly erased from the historical narrative. When you examine the concluding decades of the 19th century, the pattern becomes undeniable. Giant discoveries didn't cease because the remains stopped emerging. They ceased being reported, not naturally, not gradually. The reporting stopped. The further the archaeological work proceeded, the more the character of public documentation transformed. Initial accounts were detailed, measurements were precise, witness testimonies were recorded. But by the early 20th century, the language becomes dismissive, indefinite, and oddly incomplete, as though institutional authorities abruptly controlled what could be acknowledged. And this is where the ultimate mystery commences, because the final giant discoveries documented in American newspapers weren't dismissed due to lack of evidence. They were dismissed despite overwhelming evidence. Multiple witnesses, physical remains, photographic documentation, all systematically excluded from the accepted historical record. Imagine what it would signify if the skeletal remains discovered across North America genuinely represented a population that preceded recognized human cultures. Imagine what it means if the burial mounds weren't constructed by the ancestors of modern Native American tribes, but by an earlier, substantially larger human population that American archaeology refuses to acknowledge. And perhaps that is why the 1845 Tennessee giant was quietly erased, not to protect the remains, but to protect the narrative. The scattered newspaper accounts convey their own narrative. Workers positioned beside bones that appear almost impossible. measurements that mirror similar discoveries across the continent, evidence too consistent for coincidence, yet too disturbing for mainstream acceptance. These aren't the varieties of findings historians prefer to clarify. They're the varieties they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the ultimate question. Why was the most extraordinary evidence, the most thoroughly documented discoveries, the most witnessed skeletal remains erased from history? Because when you step back, the configuration becomes apparent. The 18-foot skeleton was disappeared. The newspaper documentation was minimized. The witness testimonies were dismissed. The museum acquisitions were hidden. The burial mound discoveries were suppressed. And even the institutional records that acknowledged these findings were systematically purged or restricted. Almost as though the excavations across 19th century America had inadvertently disclosed a chapter of human history that wasn't meant to emerge. A chapter more ancient than the Native American cultures we record, more ancient than the migration theories we teach, more ancient than the narrative we were provided. And for several decades in the 1800s, the Earth opened sufficiently to reveal it. Hundreds of giant discoveries documented in newspapers, observed by thousands of witnesses, acknowledged by scientific institutions. But rather than examining it, they erased it, suppressed it, hid it, forgot it, or feigned to. Because if North America was inhabited by a race of giants before the cultures we recognize, then the genuine question is not what was discovered in Tennessee in 1845. It's what else remains beneath the burial mounds of the continent. What other skeletal evidence, what other physical proof, what other discoveries were quietly disappeared before independent documentation existed? The Tennessee giant wasn't merely a frontier curiosity. It was a glimpse, a brief inadvertent glimpse, into a version of human history we were never intended to witness. And now that glimpse is your clue, your invitation to question everything we think we understand about who walked this continent before us. Because if an 18-foot skeleton could be discovered, displayed, documented, and then completely erased from history, imagine what else has been systematically removed from our past. Something impossible, something forbidden, something that changes everything.